Boardroom Bound, Episode 85, The Common Mistakes Made in Every Boardroom, with Patrick Dunne.
So, I think in terms of the role of the board, it's one of the things I've really focused on in the book is that, it's about right strategy, right resources, and right governance. And you can't have the right strategy unless you've got the right vision.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Patrick Dunne. He is the chair of Boardelta, which is an organization dedicated to helping make a difference for boards. That involves training, upskilling, changing board performance for a wide range of organizations, a lot in private equity, some public corporations, some nonprofits. Basically, it takes all of his many years of experience when he started out at the age of 25 working in private equity and realized boards were a fascinating place and he wanted to be involved. And you're going to hear about that story today and how that culminated in the recent book he launched called Boards, clearly one that is relevant for us. Let's jump into the show. Patrick Dunne, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thanks, Alex. Great to be here.
And of course, the world of technology today is wonderful such that you are over in the UK, we are here in the US, but it's as if we're sitting right next to each other. And the world has changed so much in the time that we're recording this that I think people are becoming to think that this might be normal, this type of connection like this.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a new normal. I long for sort of physical contact that will come, especially with my African interests. But I think for the moment, it's been great the way everyone's made it work.
But I think this will be a really interesting theme throughout the conversation today because a lot of what you do is help boards, if I want to talk about that, think about how they change their performance. And the COVID-19 has forced all organizations to rethink what they're doing, how they're doing it, which has changed some of the dialogue in the boardroom. So I'm excited to test that out with you today and get your thoughts around it. But just to set the scene for our audience, you didn't get to the point where you are now helping leading organizations around the world think through how they manage and run their businesses and how the board should operate. You had to build that over time. Can you give us a little bit of background to it?
Yeah, sure. So I came from pretty humble stock in inner city Liverpool in the UK at a time when the city was pretty depressed. So not really a natural place to end up with a FTSE 100 company. But I was good at maths. Did mathematics at university. Then my executive career was in chemicals and private equity. And in private equity, you get board experience really young. So my first board interactions were at age 25. And that's when I started to think a lot about, because I figured if you're making investments, the better the board, the more money you'll make and the less hassle you'll have. So I put a lot of thought into how boards work, what make good board directors, started doing training for our own people and then broader than that, and it sort of flowed from there, really.
So I associate this, and I'll take it to my career. So as a management consultant, very similar. You are working with CEOs at the same sort of thing. Age 25, you have no business sitting with global company CEOs, but yet you're there, you're advising them, you're coaching them, you're helping them, you're interacting with boards. I also found it fascinating. I really enjoyed it. And what it did for the same thing for me, it sort of set some ideas in my mind of this is a space that I can be helpful in, I want to enjoy with, but we're not seeing that as the norm. Most people, it's usually more probably 30s or maybe 40s and 50s thinking this is probably the next stage in my career. But that probably allowed you different opportunities because you began thinking about it earlier. And that might have been networking, it might have been skill sets you were building. Give us a sense for how that changed your trajectory, because you probably give advice to a lot of people saying, how do I get on a board? And if you could walk them back in time when they were a younger age, what would you tell people?
I got lucky because I asked some really awkward questions, which I think is hopefully in a nice way. But that's probably what you need to be doing as a board member. And the question I asked when I was 25 was, I asked my boss, when we make an investment, what do we tell the guys who are backing about what we want the board to be? And I think that curiosity and that kind of going for it, being prepared to sort of take a risk is a cool thing. I mean, interestingly, my previous call to this was with the chair of the Youth Advisory Board of the EY Foundation, which I chair. And the guy who chairs that is 21. Mm-hmm. And he also sits on the foundation board. And what's interesting was he asked me a few weeks ago if he could join the Audit and Risk Committee. That's not a natural thing for a 21-year-old to want to do. But he's going to get some fantastic experience doing that, in part because he asked, and in part because he sees the opportunity. Many young people now are joining shadow boards or next-gen boards, which some world-leading organizations now have. Gucci, the Financial Times, Interbrand, have been setting up these next-gen boards. And that's a way for many young people to get experience early. In the not-for-profit space, that's another one where you can get experience sort of younger. And so I think being prepared to ask and being curious, those are probably two big things to have on your side if you're going to go down this path.
It's fascinating you talk about the Audit and Risk Committee. When I think about a new company that I'm joining a board of, no matter what committee I'm on, let's say I got put on the Nomination and Governance Committee, I think I would put my hand up and say, I'd like to at least sit in on the audit committee meetings for the first year. I don't think there's any better way to get to know a company that you have to make sure you understand the financials and how those tick. But at the same point, I know you have a view that shouldn't be the only thing that the board is talking about. There's a much wider perspective on that. How do you balance that?
So, I think in terms of the role of the board, it's one of the things I've really focused on in the book is that, it's about right strategy, right resources, and right governance. And you can't have the right strategy unless you've got the right vision. So the board should really be focused on, and especially now, post-COVID, what should now be our vision? Is it fine the way it was, or do we need to reset it? What should be our strategy? And then have we got the right resources to fulfill that strategy? And then are we governed in the right way? And so when I think about a board, when I was doing due diligence in private equity and saying, is this a board that's backable? I would ask them, what they spent their time on, what they focused on. And if it was all on one of those three dimensions and not a balance, then I would worry a lot. I think, you need to have clarity of purpose, the right people working together in the right way, and good processes. But that needs to be in the context of a vision and a strategy, and getting the right resources to fulfill it, I think, and then making sure you are well governed.
Now, I want to give some important context for our audience. You're talking about the book you recently released, cleverly named Boards, right? So I think all of us can wrap our heads around where that's coming from. This was not your first board book. This is your fourth one, I believe, right?
Yeah. So I'm mildly dyslexic as well, so writing a book was quite a big personal challenge. But I did my first book in 97. And it came off the back of doing a pamphlet about running board meetings, because I was running a workout portfolio which had lots of dysfunctional boards in it, and I got fed up of attending bad board meetings. So, because I thought I can't write a book, I'm mildly dyslexic, this would be too difficult, I did a pamphlet, 6-page pamphlet, and it ended up that 13,000 of these pamphlets went from our lobbies around the world, and then a publisher said, well, why don't you turn this into a book? It'd be useful. So my first book had an imaginative title as well. It was called Running Board Meetings. And then the second one was a whole series of dilemmas. I've always been fascinated by problem solving, and so I came up with 20 odd situations that are tricky for directors. And the book is sort of navigates your way through. And then the third one was just a boring old handbook for non-execs, the sort of checklists and do's and don'ts. And then I kind of got a bit bored of writing, so I had a long break until last last year, and it took me probably 6 months to write the book from start to finish, and it's in two halves. There's the half around purpose, people, and process, the sort of companion, if you like, being on a board with a big focus on the people stuff and decision making and those things. And then the second half is some new dilemmas, some new situations to sort of work your way through, and some are in the business, public or private companies, and some are in the social sector.
And I imagine there might be another book brewing as a result of all the stuff that's going on with COVID-19 and how it's changing the boardroom. But without getting ahead of that too much, on the current book that you've just released, Boards, I would love to talk a little about the related organization that you got the support from and perhaps encouragement from to do it. So the Financial Times Non-Executive Director Program, a really great credential, wonderful opportunity. I've got some friends going through it now. We've talked about it on this show as well. Would love to hear more about that, an organization that you are clearly engaged with. I know you are on their club advisory board. Would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so a number of years ago, the FT decided that there was a bit of a gap in the market for director development, which was experiential, which included peer group learning, which had a very high element of experienced practitioners involved in the delivery. And so I helped set up some training and development for within 3i and within the British, European, and other venture capital and private equity associations. And so they approached me to help. I think it's now, very well developed as a series of programs ranging from a short, imaginatively titled "So You Want to Be a Non-Exec," which is
it's pretty clear.
The term in the UK for outside director, to a fully fledged diploma, which is pretty intensive and over several months. And it still has a very high caliber pool of people who attend it. Very international. It runs in London and in Hong Kong. And the participants come from all over the world, literally. And it's also got a networking side, and they have also individual guest speaker spots and stuff like that. So it's a really nicely integrated thing, and it's kind of become a sort of bit of a benchmark here in the UK.
And I know they're also working on an online version as well for the people that might be in different parts of the world to be able to take it at a time and place convenient for them.
Yeah, and it also does, and I've joined in and taken part in it, also does company-specific programs as well. So some large corporates, want everyone to go through the same thing at the same time, and some want to prepare, maybe the leadership group for board positions later. So it's got a sort of company-specific side as well as the general open program.
And Patrick, I think for our audience at this point, what we're hearing is a lot of background and expertise in this space. We can see how it developed in your career. But what we haven't talked about thus far is what actually ties all this together is your Boardelta organization that I know it's been 6+ years that you've been looking after that as the chair. Maybe you could tell us more about that, because I think that's actually, in a sense, what makes all of this sense is why you have this expertise and how you're using it.
Yeah, so in my time at 3i, I did spend a lot of time on board stuff, and also was involved helping the UK government with the Higgs Review, which was the review of large corporate governance, which came up with the senior independent director and led to the 30% club, which was promoting for more women on board. When I retired in 2012, I retired then early because I could. And also I wanted to spend more time in Africa with some social enterprises I'd founded. A number of my friends had approached me and asked me to help them with this board or that board, And one of the social enterprises I built up earlier was around conflict management. So it was helping young people manage conflict more effectively, called Leap Confronting Conflict. And what I observed was a lot of the techniques that you use with young adolescents to manage conflict actually worked with CEOs and in the boardroom. fundamentals of resolving conflict for humans are pretty similar, the context change and so on. So I started very informally just helping mates when I retired, and then I realized after a little while that actually this is quite an interesting market, and people still wanted me to carry on doing the training stuff and those sorts of things. So I set Boardelta up, and the name is simple. So Delta, if for those that are mathematical or scientifically oriented, will understand that means different. And so Boardelta is, about making a difference to boards. The work tends to be, so I don't have a website. It's all word of mouth. It tends to be on a spectrum from the very large organizations to really quite small ones. And so I do work with some very large private equity firms, and that's working with their portfolios or with themselves. So I've just done a series of things for the chairs and CEOs and CFOs of a big private equity fund, which has been really interesting. And the focus of that has been around the interaction between the board and the executive, because I think a lot of the discussion around governance and boards is focused on the non-execs and it's focused on the board. But I've never felt that you could really discuss that properly without taking into account the role of the executive. And I have this sort of Venn-like diagram in my mind most of the time, which is, there's a board with one circle and exec with another. And in bad situations, they're operating in parallel universes. There's no intersection, or they're overlapping completely, and they're all trying to do each other's jobs. In high-performing boards, you've got real clarity and real space for each of the board and the exec, and you've got a nice intersection. They all agree what should go in the intersection, and they have a productive time there. So Boardelta focuses on helping some boards where relationships between the board and the exec have become a bit strained, or maybe resetting them following a major transaction or big transformation, and then doing quite a lot around board development. So over a couple of years they can move from perhaps a difficult situation to a much more high performing situation. And then the other aspects of Boardelta are around training. So there's a partnership with the Financial Times. I do training still for the various private equity associations, and then I do quite a lot in the charity sector, so or not for profit in US term, and a lot of that I do pro bono. So Boardelta makes its money from the corporate space. It gives probably a third of its profits away to the charities I support, and it does pro bono work for some not for profits as well.
And Patrick, since we're talking about private equity, let's stick with that for a minute and explore that for our audience, because when people, let's just take the U.S. markets for a moment, people tend to think, if I want to get a board, I probably want someday the Valhalla. Like if I'm center field for the New York Yankees, that would be sitting on J.P. Morgan's board or some major public corporation like that. Those seats are very few and far between and highly competitive to get after. Not that every board seat isn't, but when you look into the private sector, think about all of the companies that private equity is involved with, and there are multiple boards and they're exponentially more. So it's an area that I encourage people to also make sure they're considering whether that's right for you, not only public, private, size of company, but the types. And private equity can be a very different type of experience. You may have an organization that just sold a piece of itself to some organization, and that private equity firm is going to put some of their people on the board. And I imagine that can create some very tense environments, which is some of the stuff you're talking about. How do you get the trust? How do you build that respect and make it work? Can you sort of paint the picture for our audience to make sure we fully understand what it's like being in a private equity board and how you build that to that point where it's the most effective it can be?
So, the starting point is it's not homogeneous. So different firms have different styles. Some private equity growth capital investments are minority positions, so a minority stake, and some are majority, and that will determine the context, if you like. The big differences are that the board members who are private equity people, so their day job is investing and making investments, will be before the business is bought or the investment is made, there will be a clear value creation plan. And their role, they will see, as being principally ensuring that that value creation plan is being followed and that they add the value that they can to support that value creation plan. So if you take a typical independent director on a private equity-backed business, unlike a public company, in a public company, a large part of the role is ensuring, that the stakeholders are being thought about, are being properly considered and taken care of. In a private equity-backed board, the private equity firm won't appoint you as an independent director in that situation to look after their investment. They'll see that's their job. They'll be appointing you to add value. So it's much more adding value than on governance, if you like. So the firm itself will do all the stuff around, it'll make sure there's proper financial reporting and risk management and all those things. And so sometimes it's a lot more fun in the private equity space because you're spending much more of your time on, strategic business development, scaling up the organization, those sorts of issues, as opposed to the base compliance type things. And if they're not public companies, obviously there's a whole group of things that you just don't need to do that public companies need and should do. So I think it's quite a different kind of thing. It may also be a shorter role. So, probably 6 years is probably what you tend to find. And it's probably a situation as well where you probably will have invested a modest amount into the business as well. So you have an aligned interest in terms of the upside or the downside if it doesn't work out. But it tends not to be a significant part of your personal net worth, so that you don't lose objectivity.
And if we sort of explain this more for audience, this is very helpful. When we tend to think of a board role, we're probably thinking of those large public type companies. You have to go from being an executive where you are hands-on to being more nose in, fingers out. And you have to figure out the right balance of the governance type questions and where is the right amount to probe without going too far. And the way you're describing private equity, it's much more, to some extent, in the weeds, because if you're a subject matter expert brought in, they're really there to use that knowledge and those connections that you have. I'd love to hear some more about this from your perspective.
Yeah, so to an extent, but also if you're the independent on that board and everyone else has bought into this, strategy, vision, value creation plan, you need to be the person who's saying, is that still the right way to go? Is that, because they're all so bought into it sometimes, you need to be that objective voice saying and asking the questions to test whether, is that still the right way to go? Is that still the right strategy? Is that still the right CEO? Is that still the right CFO? All of those things. And also, if it's not a majority investment from the private equity firm, so if there are other people who are minorities, you also need to be the person who's looking out for them to make sure their interests are protected and fulfilled. So I think there are other things that you do in that situation. But I think people have for some people, the public company environment is their natural habitat, and they love it, and it's got a higher profile, and they like that. They like the cut and the thrust of the market, and all that stuff. And other people prefer the private company space. And I think it's like most things, it's what suits you best.
And Patrick, I'd love for you to explain a bit about, from your perspective, for audience, some of whom are already in the boardroom and perhaps thinking how to become more effective, others who are aspiring. And aspiring could be a short time frame, a month or a year. They're thinking, I'm trying to get ready in the fastest way possible. Others could be a longer term thinking, how do I best make myself an attractive candidate? Whether we're talking public or private, small, large companies, there are certain things people need to do to prepare, not only building, say, a position of authority, the right expertise, the network they need to do. You were beginning to think about this at a much younger age of 25, and we have a range of people that are older ages than that still want to get in the boardroom. What's your top advice for people to help to prepare themselves and become an attractive candidate?
So, I think the first thing is to try and get good. So when I think of what good looks like, I think, you want to appoint someone who's got really good judgment. They've got really good interpersonal skills, so they're not irritatingly right, as I would describe it. So they're someone who you'd listen to and you can influence people and all of that. And they'd have really good antennae. So I would think that the best preparation is to have really good situational experience and also to learn from people who are really good. So I was very fortunate. I was young. I was, any chance I had to ask the chair or the CEO, what are they thinking about? What about this? What about that? That time that you can get with your CEO or chair is really valuable. The second thing is that you really want the light bulb to go on when people are thinking, I need a director for this. You want people who are your advocates. In the sort of mentorship game, lots of people have mentors, but not as many people have sponsors.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one of the things that's good to have is maybe a former boss or just someone you can kind of get to know who is an advocate for you, who is actually saying, you should think about Alex for this because he's got, he's really got a good sense of judgment, and he gets on with people and he influences. If you can get other people talking about you, that's much better than you having to talk to yourself. See what I mean? And it's getting out and about, I think. So, which is a problem at the moment because people are sort of more naturally confined. I don't just mean physically, but they're kind of focused. And, I found going to events where I didn't know anybody on topics I was just really interested in, but I didn't know that much about. I found that was I met a lot of people through those sort of things just because I was curious about this or that sector. So I ended up on the University of Warwick board for 9 years, one of our top universities, and because I got really interested in the university sector and kind of thinking it's really fascinating as a societal thing and as a business. And I didn't know anything about university boards, but and the vice chancellor sort of suddenly invited me to join the board. It was kind of surprising, but I think it was because of the interest I'd shown. So I think just get out and about, acquire, and just try and be as good as you can be, and then other people will recognize that and will talk about you, and it will happen.
And I would echo that point. I think sponsorship is widely underestimated. It doesn't really matter how much you know. It's who the people you know that are vouching for you, what they know about you and what you want. And having the people that are in that space, because the vast majority of board roles are filled through the personal network. And clearly you have built a great network just from a lot of the different stuff we heard about, the different places that you've been, the boards you've been on, the training that you've done, and you naturally build up that reputation. So clearly what you're saying to people is you're not going to hide it under your bush. You're going to let your light shine. You're going to go out there and make sure that people understand that you're qualified and you're ready and you're excited.
I think so, but at the same time, I think you have to have a high degree of humility. So, I think experienced chairs can spot self-promoters a mile off who haven't got the substance within. So I think that's why I think focus on trying to get just trying to be really good at it. Is probably the most important thing, really, because I think if you go too early or you haven't got those sort of skills, you'll get found out. So I think learn as much as you can from the people that you think are really good at it, and educate yourself and get out and about. Don't just learn everything from one company. And that again is a privilege of being in a private equity background. Before I was in private equity, I was with Air Products, American chemical company, did all the fuel for the space shuttle and stuff, and fabulous company and still is. And I learned a huge amount, but it was quite a closed world in a sense. I went to school and got into private equity, and that really opened my eyes to so many different types of organizations. The natures of ownership, the cultures, the whole thing, and it was just a fantastic learning experience.
Well, Patrick, that was some great advice, and we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be more boardroom bound.
Thanks very much. It was good fun.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Patrick Dunne. It was great hearing about the expertise that he brings to boardroom space and how he likes to share that with others. His books are clearly a great resource. He's written 4 of them on the boardroom, and you can just hear why he's involved with so many different organizations, from the Financial Times' non-executive director program to his own organization that trains others. Glad that he could share that knowledge with us today. Lots of takeaways for each individual person. And remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you'll find links to everything that we talked about today. Now, please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.